This last Monday, we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr.'s 94th birthday, which we always observe on a Monday. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. challenged white supremacy at a time when doing so was violently suppressed. King was opposed by an extensive system of racism, Jim Crow laws, and by the U.S. government, particularly the FBI. The FBI director at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, was obsessed with communism and believed that Reverend King was a communist and that the civil rights movement was a communist plot to destroy America, which has always been kind of weird to me, since there's nothing about communism that guarantees civil rights. There's nothing inherently about communism that is opposed to racism. And to make things even weirder, Karl Marx, whose ideas led to communism, was a very racist man. He clearly saw white people as superior to black people, making the charge that Reverend King was a communist or a Marxist kind of bizarre. And to this day, any sort of anti-racism effort is often labeled as Marxist or communist, suggesting that J. Edgar Hoover's ignorance lives on. In reality, Reverend King was a critic of both communism and capitalism. He saw issues in both. But labeling somebody a communist or Marxist didn't need to be a factual thing. It was just a convenient way to demonize anyone working on civil rights issues. And it wasn't just the FBI. Many other racist organizations in the 1960s, news networks, state and local governments combined forces to discredit Reverend King, and they even blocked any news about his efforts and his marches from the broader public. They kept those stories, particularly in the South. You wouldn't see any stories about Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in the South, about his marches. And as many of you know, the United Church of Christ, our denomination, took up that cause. And we took that situation to court, and we got that news blackout listed. We won that court case, which essentially declared that the airwaves were public and that they weren't private property that people could control. And that was a critical element in Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s efforts. Our denomination's help was central to getting his work into the news. Reverend King addressed racism from a Christian perspective, and our denomination followed his lead in a number of ways, believing that Reverend King was motivated by the Spirit of God in his efforts. In 1960, at Reverend King's request, UCC churches, and in fact it's in our records, we here at St. John's Church in Owosso, we voted on it. Would we accept black people? Would we accept people of any race as full participants in our church? Which wasn't a common thing back then. And we voted unanimously to, yes, we will accept. It was sort of our first open and affirming statement, or maybe not our first, but another one. It was mostly a symbolic vote, since black folks were not exactly welcome in Owosso at that time, particularly after sunset. Bottom line, white supremacy was so prevalent and so powerful that Reverend King eventually lost his life in his fight to advance justice in our nation. First in his fight against white supremacy, and then finally because of his objections to poverty among any and all people. To this day, racism and poverty continue to be difficult subjects to address. The majority of people in America are white and don't experience racism. So in many ways, racism can be invisible, particularly in a mostly white town like Owosso. Even talking about racism continues to be taboo in a lot of circles. So talking about racism, therefore, carries risk. It's hard, it's awkward, and it can make people very uncomfortable. In my sermon today, I'm not going to make the case that white supremacy violates Christian teachings. I'm assuming that we all get that, and that we all agree on that. Our open and affirming policy First in 1960 and most recently when we expanded it in 2016, states that we are a church that agrees to welcome people from all races as equal followers of Jesus Christ. Instead, I want to talk about why it's important, why it matters that we as a church be aware of the history of the country and the community that we find ourselves in. For example, calling the situation in America racism is actually imprecise, since in America our problem has historically been a particular kind of racism known as white privilege or white supremacy. Reverend King saw white supremacy as the cause of Jim Crow laws, of segregation, of unequal education, and unequal business opportunities. Martin Luther King Jr. was not fighting racism in general or generically so much as he was fighting white supremacy and the poverty that it causes. Reverend King was fighting public policies, laws, and practices that gave preference to white people based simply on their race, that treated white people with more respect and privilege than non-white people, that valued white people more, both in secular and in religious settings. White supremacy is a huge problem in America because it has for hundreds of years been baked into our culture and enforced by political power, literally enforced and maintained by our country as a whole. And while there has been progress in some areas, in a lot of ways, the situation today is pretty similar to what Reverend King faced in the 1960s. For example, white men, such as myself, make up about 30% of the population, but we hold 80% of all corporate board positions. It's pretty unusual to look at a boardroom in a major corporation and see all black folks. Yet most of us don't feel that it's unusual when we see a photo of all white folks in such powerful position because it just looks normal to us. Deep segregation in power is the result of hundreds of years of slavery and discrimination built into our country's practices and laws. And just like in Reverend King's day, we still have highly segregated communities. Even though the practice of redlining is illegal now, norms based on an underlying acceptance of the idea of white supremacy have been adhered to for much of our history. One of the biggest reasons that there are so few black folks in Owosso today, or for much of our history, black folks were not welcome in a lot of small towns around here. We're not unique in that aspect. And as history has shown, separate but equal is pretty much never actually equal. For hundreds of years, black folks in our country have tended to live in communities with schools with fewer resources than majority white schools tend to have, with less experienced teachers, larger class sizes, older and fewer books, buildings that aren't as conducive to learning to begin with. And then the kids from these districts end up being less likely to go on to higher education. Things are better in this area now than where they were in the 50s and 60s, but significant disparities continue to exist in school districts. And to this day, as a lingering result of all these policies and practices, black folks have much less wealth than white folks do on average. The wealth and income gaps are large and easy to see. White folks on average have about 7 times, not twice as much, 7 times more wealth than black folks on average, which is, by the way, pretty much the way things were in the 1960s, which is noted by Reverend King. The racial wealth gap is important because despite everything Jesus taught about valuing the poor, the oppressed, and the powerless, we too often value people based on wealth. Now, it would just seem realistic to me to consider that years of denying black people educational opportunities and years of limiting people's opportunities for advancement in the workplace based on their race would lead to a gap in wealth like this, based on race. That the reality of hundreds of years of discrimination based on race would result in these sorts of statistics. But the sad truth is that our schools don't teach kids this reality. They don't teach kids the history of racism and white supremacy in our country. We've glossed over it. So what that leaves kids with, and the adults who grow up to assume that the reason black people are poor in our country is due to deficiencies in black people themselves. It's an assumption, by the way, that is not just limited to white kids. Kids of every race can easily draw the wrong conclusions and internalize beliefs that white people are superior, even to the point that it makes them believe deep down that they are less worthy because they are black. They see it in community. Why is it the black folks' homes and the white folks' homes, why are their cars so different? This is obvious. This is heartbreaking, too, to see in our children when we don't give them the context so they understand that this is not natural, that there's a history that caused this. As we reflect this week on Reverend King's legacy, I think segregation, the wealth gap, the education gap are three of the biggest issues that Reverend King talked about that remain unaddressed. As Christians, if we are to be good news for the poor, we must be aware that poverty has a racial element, that proportionally more black folks are poor because of grinding, long-term racism and white privilege that dates back literally hundreds of years. And then once we acknowledge it, what are we going to do about it? Well, for one thing, I think we should start off by avoiding judging others. For instance, we should not be engaged in labeling other people as racists. Even if someone does something that is very racist, remember that we can all change and heal. Labeling someone a racist is no more helpful than labeling somebody a Marxist. But we need to become better at noticing racism and recognizing its impacts. And then to become better at responding to it in helpful ways, in ways that transform rather than judge. And it's helpful, I think, to understand that racism or white supremacy exists at many levels. It's not as simple as it might seem. Few of us are actually experts on this. We're just used to this stuff. And so let me kind of go through some of the levels of, this isn't all of them, but this is I think, some of the big ones. That first off, racism exists at a personal level. That flowing from our own personal values, beliefs, attitudes, and feelings. For example, the belief that European American culture and religious traditions are inherently superior to others. That's an example of that belief, individual racism. This kind of racism exists mostly in our heads. It's part of how we look at the world as individuals, and we call that personal racism. Racism at the personal level, racism in our heads, often leads to racism at the next level, which I'll call the interpersonal level. Racism at the interpersonal level is much easier to see. In fact, this is where it becomes visible. It's the racist things we say, that we do, the things we say out loud to each other. Racism at the interpersonal level occurs when we act on our white privilege beliefs, prejudices, and stereotypes in ways that others can see or in ways that impact others. Interpersonal racism is demonstrated when we treat black people as inferior, when we treat them as if they're children, or when we avoid them entirely. Racism at the personal and interpersonal level leads naturally to the next level, which is institutional and ultimately structural racism. Systems such as Jim Crow laws fall into this category. Remember that Jim Crow laws were laws in the South that enforced separate public accommodations and separate businesses for black and whites. And this was not that long ago. The supporters of Jim Crow laws did not see themselves as racist. They felt that separate but equal was God's plan. It was natural from a white supremacy perspective. Jim Crow laws were dismantled after Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists exposed their racist roots and the pain and poverty that they caused. Defeating the institutional racism embodied in Jim Crow laws was a critical step, but it didn't end the problem. Even today, structural racism continues in practices such as racial profiling, racially based justice and incarceration, segregation, unequal educational systems, unequal employment opportunities, and more. And while we've made significant progress in some of these areas, in others, the majority population still mostly overlooks the impact of racism. We can't see it because we're not experiencing it. It's obvious that personal racism leads to interpersonal racism and finally to institutional and structural racism, but notice that it also flows in the other direction. Institutional racism feeds personal racism as our young people grow up observing these practices and adopting the underlying racist attitudes behind them. All levels of racism, personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural, need to be addressed simultaneously for us to progress in our desire to create a just world as suggested by Christ's teachings. The Bible talks a lot about not showing favoritism. We read a couple of those verses today, and of course Jesus taught that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. Yet racism or white supremacy continues to thrive, continues to rob another generation of worth and of spiritual health. Towards the end of his life, Reverend King started talking more about the problem of poverty. That poverty at the root of racism and how it related to the problems of crime, hunger, and homelessness, that was maybe the biggest issue. Not just racism, but poverty. In November of 1967, Reverend King's efforts shifted noticeably from a focus on white supremacy more towards being good news for the poor in general. That's when Reverend King created what he called the Poor People's Campaign, which Reverend King saw as the next logical step or an adjustment in his course in the pursuit of justice, of a just world, based on his experience and his biblical knowledge. And this shift turned out to be critically important. Some of Reverend King's closest friends were not happy about this change in focus. They felt it was too ambitious, too difficult to communicate, and they felt it was way too dangerous. Reverend King described the Poor People's Campaign as the beginning of a new cooperation, a new understanding, and a determination by poor people of all colors, all backgrounds, to win their right to a decent life. And it began to catch on quickly as several leaders of American Indian, Puerto Rican, Mexican American, and poor white communities immediately jumped on board and pledged their support for Martin Luther King Jr.'s new Poor People's Campaign. But tragically, Reverend King only remained alive about 4 months after first announcing his Poor People's Campaign. And many of his followers felt that it was this shift in focus that led to his death. While plenty of people wanted Reverend King dead in response to his success in areas like voting rights and civil rights, it was ultimately his focus on the poor that was quite likely the last straw. It was too much for his opponents to tolerate. And we don't know for sure it was the Poor People's Campaign that ultimately led to Reverend King's death. We do know that addressing this problem, the basic issue of how we treat the poor, has been one of the biggest focuses of biblical prophets since the beginning of written history. And as a follower of Jesus Christ, Reverend King's efforts in racial justice eventually distilled down to the biblical imperative to be good news for the poor. Reverend King longed for a country that judged people by the content of their character. But the reality is that we still judge people based on their wealth and their popularity. That's part of why in our food pantry ministry That we work hard to ensure not only that people receive food to eat, but also that we treat them with dignity and with respect. That we treat them as our guests, for whom we are privileged to serve. Poverty, racism, they're deep. It impacts us all, and it's very complicated. But also the stigma of poverty is very real, and the two are related. We don't live in a colorblind world. People are still judged by the color of their skin as well as by how much money they have and where they live and all sorts of other things other than the content of their character. We must continue to remind ourselves of the gap between where we really are and where we want to be. We have a lot of work to do if we are truly to be good news for the poor